Science,
engineering,
medicine,
chemistry,
physics,
biology, humanities, cardiology,
entrepreneurship, public health, global
aeronautics, science communication.
Hello again, everyone. I'm Gareth Mitchell. Today, global attitudes to COVID, from face coverings to the gradual return to the workplace. A big survey has some illuminating findings, including what people around the world think of vaccines.
What we've seen is that willingness to get the vaccine has increased, and over half of respondents across all of our countries surveyed, except for France, report that they would definitely get a vaccine if made available to them this week.
And beyond the pandemic, some of the other big issues of our times are on the agenda in this edition, as Imperial joins forces with governments and other research institutions to tackle the climate emergency and also launches a new global development hub. All right, well, let's have some news. Hayley Dunning is here, and I love this, Hayley. I'm quite excited about this story. It's about DigiFAB. Is this something out of Thunderbirds? What's going on here? Tell me about DigiFAB.
That would be wonderful, but what it actually is our new Institute for Digital Molecular Design and Fabrication. So digital, and fabrication.
See what they did there.
Yep. They just kind of made it cool. But what it actually is a new institute here at Imperial that launched this week. And it's all about making chemical reactions much more efficient and kind of bringing them into the 21st century by making them digital. If you think about chemistry, if you think about doing it at school and all the experiments you did, you got like all these beakers and you measure stuff out and then you run the experiment and you write down when certain things happen and when you've got a certain amount of material coming out with it. And it's all quite laborious. But what this institute aims to do is to help make it a lot more automated, but also use a lot more sort of machine learning and data techniques so that these processes can be more efficient in the future. So the kind of way it works is you imagine that you could model reactions, the reactions that happen on a computer, and predict the behaviour of molecules and what they do when they react, and that helps you design experiments. And then when you're doing experiments, you can run several experiments together with slightly different parameters. And you can have automatic data taking throughout that, so it can see what is actually making the quickest reactions and the ones that produce the most amount of the material that you want. And with that, of course, imagine taking this to a much higher level. Then if you want to industrially make these chemicals, then you want to make the most efficient reaction. And that actually helps them be more sustainable as well, because you've got less waste materials.
Well, I nearly asked you what's been the reaction so far, but maybe I should just ask you, Hayley, what about the real-world applications to all this? How is it all going to be applied?
Yeah, so when we talk about chemicals, it can be rather obscure, like I said, kind of coloured liquids in tubes that you remember from school. But chemicals produce so much of what is important for us in our life, and this is important for future health, environment, and energy. So, for example, it helps produce fertilisers and things to help us with more efficient agriculture and producing food. New materials for new kind of energy types, and also for healthcare, so for making new pharmaceuticals, new drugs, and vaccines.
And who is involved?
So this is really run out of the Department of Chemistry here at Imperial, so it's led by Professor Sophia Yalaraki, with plenty of collaborators across chemistry and of course across the college as a whole, including our RAW lab, which is the Rapid Online Analysis of Reactions, where they have some quite cool robots already.
All right, Hayley, thank you very much indeed for that. Now we are joined for the first time on this podcast, actually, by Neil Jennings of the Grantham Institute. And Neil, there's an event next week about climate change and mental health, an incredibly important issue. So tell me about the event.
Sure. So we're bringing together a whole range of experts to discuss this issue. So the kind of issues around climate change and mental health are often discussed in kind of isolation, but often we don't look enough at the synergies and the interaction that the two issues have upon each other. So in collaboration with the Institute for Global Health Innovation, we are launching a paper which brings together all the evidence around the impact that climate change is having upon mental health and emotional well-being. So, for example, the increasing temperatures that we're seeing is increasing people's exposure to extreme weather events like floods, which has a negative impact in terms of people's mental health and emotional well-being and indeed causes trauma. So we're bringing together a whole variety of experts for an event next Thursday. People can register for this event online. So if you go on the Grantham website, there's a link to sign up there. We've got Imperial's very own Emma Lawrence, who is Mental Health Innovations Fellow. We've got Adrian James, who's President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and a whole bunch of other fantastic speakers as well. It'd be great if your listeners would be willing to join us, because we'd love to have them.
And of course, people can find out more on the Grantham Institute website. Well, good luck with the event, Neil, and thank you very much for coming on to the podcast. That's Neil Jennings of the Grantham Institute. Well, now, a year of COVID data and a year's worth of valuable global insights. More people wearing face masks in many countries, but willingness to self-isolate is down. Those are just two insights from a newly published report. Here's Justine.
Hello, my name is Justine Alford and I'm the Communications Manager at Imperial's Institute of Global Health Innovation. And right now I'm very pleased to be joined by Melanie Lees, Director of our Big Data and Analytical Unit. And Melanie is going to tell us about a new report from the COVID Data Hub programme, which Melanie co-leads with Sarah Jones, who's a postdoctoral researcher also at IGHI. So this report focuses on three main areas. Maybe let's start with the first. People's adherence to protective measures like face mask use and self-isolation. What were your headline findings?
Two key themes that emerged from this section of the report for me were, number one, more people are wearing face masks today compared to last year, and number two, more people are returning to work outside the home. So on the face mask question, we saw an increase in the use of face masks in all of our 14 countries surveyed since April 2020, with the most significant increase seen in the Nordic countries. Sweden has gone from 6% of people reporting they wear face masks outside the home to 36%. Norway has gone from 10% to 74%. And most surprisingly, Denmark has gone from 6% to 80%. And even if these are the most significant countries, we do see a pretty steady increase in all countries surveyed in terms of the use of face masks. And the second finding that I think is quite interesting is that more people are returning to work outside the home. In all countries surveyed except for Japan, the share of respondents who report avoiding working outside the home was lower in April 2021 than it was in April 2020.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. It looks like there's lots of differences across the world that you've been seeing over the past year. And next, you looked at well-being and life satisfaction. So what did you see in these two areas?
This section has really benefited from the knowledge and expertise of our collaborators from the World Happiness Report team. And what we see is that as of today, people are largely unhappier or as happy as they were a year ago. So throughout the study period, we find significant differences in countries where the Nordic countries appear to report the highest life satisfaction, while some of the Asian countries appear to report the lowest. But in half of the countries surveyed, reported life satisfaction decreased between May 2020 and April 2021, with South Korea reporting the most significant decrease. And 6 countries saw virtually no change, and only the Netherlands reported a higher life satisfaction in early 2021 than it did in May 2020.
Again, so some really interesting differences emerging across the world. I wonder if you see the same in your final area which you looked at, which was onto trust. So how are people's opinions of vaccination changing?
So since November 2020, what we've seen is that willingness to get the vaccine has increased in 13 of the 14 countries surveyed. And as of April 2021, over half of respondents across all of our countries surveyed, except for France, report that they would definitely get a vaccine if made available to them this week. Concerns about side effects of a COVID-19 vaccine are lower now than they were in November, but they are increasing in some countries, particularly since the beginning of the year. So as of April 2021, over half of the population were still concerned about side effects in 5 of the 14 countries surveyed. And this to us indicates a very important message to health authorities and to governments to really try to understand what people's concerns are and address these if we want vaccination uptake to continue to rise. One important thing to note, though, is that most people do trust COVID-19 vaccines, but there are important access issues. So in the latest data available, over 50% of the population reports trust in the COVID-19 vaccines in all surveyed countries except Japan. The UK has the highest level of reported trust. And this is despite vaccines not being necessarily available to all of the survey respondents. So, for example, fewer than half of respondents in most of the countries surveyed reported that vaccines were not hard for them to get. So despite clear access issues right now, it is definitely positive to see that in most countries, people seem to be eagerly awaiting the chance to get their vaccine.
You also looked at people's trust in the government and health system. So how has that been changing over the year?
So people's views on how their governments and health systems are handling the pandemic unfortunately have worsened since we started asking these questions in June 2020. While confidence in the health authorities is typically higher than confidence in government's response, we do see that the share of people who believed that the government was handling the pandemic well decreased in 12 of the 14 countries surveyed. And during the same time frame, confidence in health authority systems' ability to respond to COVID-19 decreased in, similarly, 11 of the 14 countries surveyed. But there is an important spread across the responses of the different countries. Respondents who believed their governments are handling the pandemic poorly varied from 9% in Singapore to 73% in Japan. And respondents who reported no confidence in their health authorities or very little confidence varied from 10% in Singapore to 58% in France. So really, we see very, very varied responses in terms of how trust is reflected both in the health authorities and in the government's response to the pandemic.
Fascinating. Your report and your tracker has gathered a huge amount of interesting insights over the past year, and we hope that, of course, it will continue to do so. We really very much look forward to seeing how the project continues to progress over time. Thank you very much for sharing all of this with me today, Melanie. It was really great to chat.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
That's Melanie Leese speaking to Justine Alford. Well, now it's an emergency within the climate emergency. The fate of the icy regions of our planet at the polar caps and the high mountains. It's called the cryosphere, and it includes the likes of glaciers, snowpack, permafrost, polar ice sheets and sea ice. Rises in carbon emissions and global temperatures can affect these regions drastically with potentially catastrophic results. Safeguarding the cryosphere makes it all the more urgent to cut carbon emissions. And that's why we've just seen the launch of a new coalition devoted to reducing emissions by 50% by 2030. So it's the 50-30 Coalition, and it's a grouping of governments and research institutions, one of which is the Grantham Institute, whose Director of Research is Yuri Rogel, and he's been speaking to Lindsay Winton, who's one of his Grantham Institute colleagues, and she began by asking how the 50 by 30 target differs from the goals of the Paris Agreement.
So the Paris Agreement sets very large, ambitious, overarching goals. There is a temperature target in the Paris Agreement, holding warming well below 2 degrees and pursuing to limit it to 1.5. Well, that's a global target. That's for the entire planet to achieve. It also sets what we call mitigation target, but again, a global one. It says we need to peak global greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, decline emissions rapidly thereafter, and then reach basically net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the second half of the century. So these are really global, not so specific targets for countries to know what they should be doing. After the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a special report dedicated to the question of how we can limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and that was in 2018. And that report shows that to limit warming to 1.5, we should halve our global emissions by 2030 and then reach net zero CO2 emissions by mid-century. And so with our coalition, we really call for the globe and governments as part of our global society to put our economies and our society on a track to reaching those goals.
I wondered if you would explain what the cryosphere is and how it will be affected by climate change.
The cryosphere are basically all those areas of our planet that are frozen, that are covered with ice or snow. Most of them, of course, occur around the poles, the Antarctic and the Arctic, but also mountain glaciers are part of our cryosphere. They are particularly impacted by climate change. First of all, they're very vulnerable. Mountain glaciers are retreating rapidly, and this retreat is often irreversible. So that means that we will be losing those mountain glaciers if we don't stop the warming that we are currently causing rapidly. At the same time, the cryosphere is also an interesting player in causing global warming. There are vast amounts of carbon dioxide and methane stored in the frozen soils of the Siberian and the Canadian tundra, which we call the permafrost. And these parts of the planet are currently thawing. And with the thaw comes also a release of carbon dioxide and methane. And this is basically reinforcing or amplifying the global warming that we as humans are causing. So that is another reason why the cryosphere is such an important part and such a sensitive part to global warming.
In terms of the meaningful action, rather than rhetoric that's urgently needed by world governments to stop these irreversible changes. What is it that the 50-30 coalition is hoping to achieve in terms of ensuring global action happens as soon as possible?
So as part of the momentum building towards the next climate summit that will be held in Glasgow at the end of the year, many countries and many companies are putting forward net zero targets. They basically want to eliminate all the emissions that they are producing. And these are really important targets, but the downside of these targets is that most of them are for pretty far into the future. They are set for mid-century, shortly thereafter, or shortly before. What is necessary for meaningful action is that these long-term targets are really accompanied by near-term action. Near-term action that puts a company, a country, and also the globe as a whole on a track towards achieving that net zero by 2050. And that means that there needs to be an ambitious intent, but there also needs to be a clear plan of how it will be implemented over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years. And that is what the 50-by-30 coalition calls for. And it also links perfectly to the ambitions of the climate summit. As part of the process that was started by the Paris Agreement, every 5 years, countries need to update their pledges, which are called nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. And this year, or at the Glasgow summit, is the first year that countries now need to step up and come forward with new, strengthened, and more ambitious pledges. So this is a key milestone to see how well the Paris Agreement can work in order to keep warming to safe limits.
Yuri Rogel speaking there to Lindsay Winton. Well, finally, from a new coalition to a new hub, again with big Imperial involvement and again tackling some of the most pressing issues of these times. Here's Hayley Dunning.
This month saw the virtual launch of the Global Development Hub at Imperial. The hub brings together Imperial's expertise to maximise the global impact of our world-leading research, education and innovation, to engage with the United Nations Sustainable Agenda 2030, and to prepare for the sustainability challenges that might arise 20, 30 or even 50 years into the future. To open the event, Professor Mike Templeton, Professor of Public Health Engineering at Imperial and co-chair of the hub, explained more about its vision.
Imperial College has an unrivaled reputation in STEM education and research, where STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And Imperial is therefore in a key position to formally draw together, contribute to, and enhance interdisciplinary collaborations towards the United Nations Sustainable Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs for short. Overall, the Hub aims to create a community building and networking platform focused on Imperial College London's contribution to sustainable development as a global top 10 university. Engaging with the SDGs in this way will help to capture demand for SDG-related education, build new partnerships, and ultimately define a university that's responsible and globally aware.
We were then honoured to be joined by Amina J. Muhammad, the UN Deputy Secretary General, who led the process that resulted in the global agreement around the Sustainable Development Agenda and goals. She opened her address by explaining more about the aims of the agenda and where the world is at now.
Leaders really made a bold promise to transform our world by 2030, to end poverty and hunger, to provide quality healthcare and education for all, but also to achieve gender equality and eliminate discrimination in all its forms. Combating climate change and power prosperity through a cleaner, greener economy was also a very big ask, and to secure peace, justice, and freedom from violence for all. Today, when it comes to the promise that matters most, and that's improving lives of people and the health of our planet, sadly, we are still far from where we need to be. And this was even before the COVID pandemic hit. Reverting to the world as it existed before the pandemic is simply really not an option. And this is where we have to flip the orthodoxy and think differently, looking at the type of response that we have today in order to get a recovery that really does put us ahead and closer to achieving the SDGs. In all of this, science, technology, and innovation is going to be absolutely key. And that's why I'm so encouraged by the launch of the Global Development Hub today. The Hub speaks to the need to conduct multidisciplinary research, capacity building, peer learning, and knowledge exchange that brings together institutions and partners across the world that can help us move more decisively towards sustainability and equity.
Amina was then joined by Professor David Nabarro, who is World Health Organization's Special Envoy on COVID-19 and co-director of Imperial's Institute of Global Health Innovation, for a special Q&A session. One of his most important questions was around just what we at Imperial can do.
How can researchers from a group like Imperial really organise themselves to achieve the greatest possible impact through their focus in relation to the SDGs?
Well, I think first acknowledging and having an understanding that this is a universal agenda. And so creating the capacities to deal with some of the innovation that needs to happen to lift the agenda, but being very focused on 3 or 4 areas where these are going to be game changers in what happens with growing economies more inclusively. And so I do say that, unpacking what it means to have a just transition, understanding what the energy mix of a country is and how best that country could not only transition to more renewables, but how that would create jobs, how that would strengthen institutions, how that brings in communities and livelihoods that have an opportunity to grow. There is research that takes time, and necessarily so. But I think contextually, we have to find ways of action research getting into the hands of policymakers who are able to take those decisions for investing now. And that, I think, is what's really important, is how we get this together at the local level with this, as we would say, low-hanging fruit. What existing research can we use? What more can we add to that to connect what needs to happen at country level to perhaps making the case for the foreign direct investment to come down, to perhaps look at the risks that we see and how best we can mitigate them, what financial institutions could we use, and the partners in business and in academia.
That's Amina J. Mohammed, Deputy Secretary-General of the United Nations, ending that report from Hayley Dunning at the virtual launch of the new Global Development Hub. And if you'd like to catch up on the full launch events, then just head to Imperial College's YouTube channel. And there you can also hear from the other speakers at that event, Dr. Heidi Hackman, CEO of the International Science Council, Anna Avaliani, Head of Enterprise at the Royal Academy of Engineering, and Zine Abdallah, Chair of the MasterCard Foundation, and also a college alumnus. So that's on Imperial College's YouTube channel. And furthermore, by the way, the Hub has recently launched an SDG of the Month webinar series. So the next event will discuss Sustainable Development Goal 6, clean water and sanitation, and that's scheduled for Wednesday, the 26th of May. You can register via the Imperial College events page. Well, that'll be it for this edition. Don't forget that we're on all your favourite podcatchers, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud, and indeed Entail. I'm Gareth Mitchell, and from me and all of us here on the podcast team, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.